So typography, well, let's just go ahead and work through our, I've only got, there are, I believe, 10 slides on this slideshow, and I'm only going to, I'm not going to belabor it too much, let's put it that way. I'm going to show a couple of YouTube videos, get down some vocabulary, and then we'll get into Photopea and look a little bit about how to work with type in Photopea. Okay, so we'll show the video and then, let's see here, let's do this. I'll be taking notes as we're looking at it.
Is power. The power to express words and ideas visually. It's timeless, but always changing. And that's what we're going to explore. Most people agree that the creator of typography was a German man named Johannes Gutenberg, and yes, he wore a hat. Before Gutenberg came along and revolutionized the world of communication, books needed to be scribed by hand, usually by monks, which was very time-consuming and expensive. So Gutenberg created blackletter, the first ever typeface, modeled after the writing of the scribes. Blackletter has thick vertical lines and thin horizontal connectors, which made it great for scribing, but it looked very dense and squished together when printed. Something needed to change. Enter Roman type. This particular typeface is Cambria, which you're probably used to seeing on your word processor, but the first ever Roman typeface was created in the 15th century by the Frenchman Nicolas Jenson. This is his typeface right here. Jenson worked mainly in Venice, Italy, and was inspired by the lettering found on ancient Roman buildings. His letter forms were based on straight lines and regular curves. This made them very clear and legible compared to the dense darkness of blackletter. This legible new typeface was an instant success and quickly spread across Europe, riding on the coattails of the Renaissance. The next major innovation in typography after Roman letters was italics, which are like slanted and stylized versions of Roman type. They were created in the late 15th century by Aldus Manutius from Italy as a way of fitting more letters onto the page and saving money. Now we use italics interspersed with Roman type for emphasis. Aldus Manutius also created the modern comma and semicolon, but that's another story. Type development stayed fairly stagnant until the 18th century in England, when William Caslon created a typeface that set a new standard for legibility. While it wasn't anything radical, it was just what the world was looking for. The style of Caslon's typeface is now referred to as Old Style. A few decades later, another Brit named John Baskerville created a new variety of typeface, which we call transitional. Later still, a Frenchman named Didot and an Italian named Bodoni created typefaces that we have classified as modern. Most serif typefaces fit into one of these three categories, but what does each category mean? An old-style typeface has letters that have thick serifs and low contrast between thick and thin strokes. A transitional typeface has letters with thinner serifs and a higher contrast between thick and thin strokes. And a modern typeface has letters with very thin serifs and extreme contrast between thick and thin strokes. Next, William Caslon's great-grandson, named William Caslon IV, got sick of all of these serifs, so he decided to remove them entirely and made a new kind of typeface called a sans serif. It didn't catch on immediately, but would eventually get really big. During the Second Industrial Revolution, advertising created a need
Can you do what?
Go upstairs.
To do what?
Letters were made
Work on
taller
art projects.
No.
and wider.
Gotta stay here because you're gonna need this
Sizes on posters
for
and
this
billboards.
project.
Things got pretty weird, but one happy result of all of this experimentation is Egyptian, or slab serif. It has really thick serifs and is usually used for titles. As a backlash to the complexity found in typefaces of the 19th century, the early 20th century brought something simple. Paul Renner from Germany created a typeface called Futura, and it was based on simple geometric shapes. This is called the geometric sans. Around the same time, a British man named Eric Gill created a typeface called Gill Sans that was similar to a geometric sans, but with gentler, more natural curves. And this is called a humanist sans. The next major step in the world of sans serifs happened in Switzerland in 1957 with the introduction of Helvetica. It has simple curves and is available in many different ways, and some would call it the world's favorite typeface. The world of typography changed forever with the introduction of the computer. There were a few difficult years of crude pixel type due to the primitive screen technology. But then technology evolved and computers began to allow for the creation of thousands of beautiful typefaces and the odd dud. But now anyone has the freedom to create their own unique typeface. And that is the history of typography.
Oh, stop it. Okay, so these are, I just want you to worry about serif and sans serif, but let's define what is the, what's the use of typography? Why do we bother, especially as graphic designers, worrying, concentrating so much on typography and type? Why? I've learned that in some art schools in Southern California and other places, they have professors, teachers, plural, whose only job is to teach typography. It's all they do. And I'm thinking, wow. That is amazing. So what does typography do for us? Think the obvious. Think the obvious. It does communicate. Now this one started out with a type is power. That's kind of a pretty extraordinary thing to say. Okay, so it helps us communicate. How does it help us communicate? Good morning. Oh, come on, you guys, come on. How does typography help? Oh, I thought you had your hand up. Help us communicate. You have no idea. Yes. It displays an emotion. Yeah, that's one thing. Yes. Okay. Nobody can think of the obvious, huh? Typography is about letters. Well, now you know. Now we all know. Okay? And letters create words. And lots of words put together in particular orders create sentences and paragraphs and then chapters and then books, if we want to go that far, which helps to communicate. Okay? Now, in all those type styles that YouTube video shared with us from the very beginning, from handwritten calligraphy all the way up to Helvetica, okay? What happened to text through the years? How did it change? What was it like in the early days, and what is it like now? How many have people who can, in your family, have seen people who write letters in what they call cursive? Anybody know how to write in cursive? Oh man, that's a lost art. I'm telling you, jeez. Right? So you've seen, I believe, letters that are written in cursive, right? How many think that's easy to read? Yeah, kind of, sort of. Yeah, okay. For some people, especially my cursive, it's not easier to read. Okay. So when you're looking, how many have seen ancient text from the Middle Ages? You know, the real fancy stuff, you know, with all the, you know, calligraphy and all that kind of stuff. You really got to slow down to read it because it's difficult to read, right? So as typography changed through the ages, it became easier to read. It became easier to recognize letters. It became easier to transmit and accept information, okay? So Gutenberg, printing press, 1400s. What was the significance of that invention? And trust me, it was like an earthquake in humanity. The printing press. What did that do? Boy, you guys in your history, either that or it's really early this morning, or a combination thereof. Okay, so before the printing press, anything that was written and communicated from one person to another by writing, it was handwritten by scribes, and most of the time it was biblical text. Who could read that? Not many people. People who were trained to read that, and people who spent their lives reading and writing that. But the mass population had to rely on other people to tell them what that text said and meant. And then Gutenberg, I'm sure he wasn't the only one at the time, but anyway, he's known for creating the printing press, right? So that was taking the ability to then print thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of the same text, which meant what? Which meant hundreds and hundreds of people now could take that paper and read it. They could learn how to read it, and they read it, and they created this stuff called books, and now hundreds and hundreds of people were becoming what? Smarter, educated, absolutely true. And this was a problem for people who had the control of the information, because now people could verify that what they were being told was actually true. And as people became more educated, the world changed dramatically, okay? And a lot of scribes lost their jobs because they didn't need people to hand write hundreds and hundreds of pages of text so that other people could read it, okay? And all of this had to do with typography. So initially, like the first black letters, very ornate and very decorative and very difficult to read. So they changed the style of the letter so that the lettering could become more easy to read or more legible, right? Okay. And they started out with this stuff called serif, okay? Serif has a little bit, they have little lines at the ends of the letters, and it's a little more decorative, okay? Sans serif, sans means without or to take away, right? So they have letters that take away all these decorative little lines at the end of the letters, okay, without serif, okay? And these are just more decorative fonts over here, right? Now, how many of you read books, whether it's digitally or actually a physical book, right? So those letters are pretty small, right? And there's lots of them, right? And most of the time they are serif fonts, which means they have the little decoration things on the top and the bottom, okay? And then when you look at signs on the highway, it's sans serif, very plain letters. Each of them are very readable in their own context. Now, does anybody know why we continue to use these serif fonts when we're making pages and pages of text? Because believe it or not, and you won't when I tell you, initially it's easier to read more quickly fonts that are serif fonts as opposed to fonts that are sans serif or more simple, more plain. Because you've heard the phrase read between the lines, right? And when you're learning how to read quickly and your comprehension increases, you're literally reading between the lines, and your eye begins to recognize the difference between a small h and a small f and a small t and a lowercase g and q, okay, and a capital letter and a lowercase letter, it recognizes that very, very quickly because of the design of the letter. If those letters look the same, but they're different letters, it's going to be much more difficult to read. So serif fonts actually are easier to read a block of text more quickly. Sans serif is easy to read when it's like a title. So when you're coming down the freeway and you're looking at a bulletin board or you're looking at a highway sign, it's typically very plain text, because how much time do you take to read a bulletin board as you're driving on the freeway? How much time do you think you typically take?
Like a few seconds.
Yeah, maybe a second. Maybe. Maybe two if you're really driving slow, right? And so you have a few words that are very simple font, and it's very easy to read. Okay. So as we come in history, okay, we get, this is easier to read. I'm going to put it in paragraphs. Sans serif is easier to read in small amounts. I put Helvetica on there. Okay, I put Roman type and Helvetica. Okay, how many have heard of Times New Roman? All right, good job. So if you're writing a reference letter, you're writing a letter, you're writing a short essay for a class, Times New Roman is probably the font you want to go with, because when you have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 paragraphs, it's easy to read. And remember, you want to make things easy on the person who's grading it, right? It's okay. If you like some sort of weird font style, fine, go for it. But when you're turning something in for somebody else to read, make it easy for them, okay? So Times New Roman is an easy one to read when you have a few paragraphs to read. Helvetica, okay? There's a whole Netflix documentary of, like, 2 hours on that one font style, right? But it's fascinating when you think about how it was developed and how it was styled and how it's used. And it's used everywhere. So if you're making like a title or a billboard or something like that, something like Helvetica is going to be your go-to font. You're going to start there, okay? So the style of letters directly relates to how you're going to communicate emotion, feeling, and meaning. Now here's some other, as we go through, the style of letters that you use create a certain effect. The font that we saw for Baskin-Robbins, very playful and childlike. The font that you saw for FedEx is very businesslike and very direct, okay? The font that you saw for Amazon, all of this is very, very, very intentional in the graphic designers who created them. Extremely intentional, so you have to be intentional as well. Fonts to avoid, well, okay, yes and no, it depends. Comic Sans is one of those fonts that everybody loves to hate. They just do, okay? In some places it works, in other places not so much, okay? But all of these, the one thing that you can probably say is, in their own way, kind of hard to read, kind of hard to get through quickly, right?
Comic Sans is like a basic pitch font.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So combining fonts, and we'll talk about that. Important terminology. Okay. So we'll talk about this a little bit, but here's some more vocab, and this relates to the poster that I have up here and the poster that you saw in the quiz. Okay. So we have kerning. And you gotta, is the space between letters. And that's all letters. It's not only the space between the letters in a word, but it's also the space between one word and the next word, okay? So you guys know that I've been around for a while, right? So when I was in high school and we were learning how to prepare ourselves for the business world, they had a typing class. So you had a classroom full of typewriters. Anybody seen a typewriter? Never? Click, 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 ding, click, 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 right? And when we came to the end of a sentence, it was very important to put 2 spaces between one sentence and another sentence, right? Now with technology, no, you don't want to do that. And the reason is because with a typewriter, since it's very mechanical, every space between every letter was exactly the same. It didn't matter if the letter was an A or an O or an I. I takes up less space, okay? So that double space after each sentence was enough of a space visually to indicate to your eye, oh, new sentence, okay? But now with technology, with computer technology, they actually have the same space between each letter of every word. So now it's no longer a critical point to put 2 spaces at the end of a sentence. Boy, was that an interesting discussion when that was changing. Oh, man. Anyway, so kerning is the space between letters. So you can have letters that actually bump up next to each other, or letters that are very spaced out. And it gives a different feeling each way that it goes. Then we have leading. I always have to stop and think about how to pronounce leading and leading and reading and reading. Anyway, leading is the space between one line of text and the next. Okay? So as you're going from top to bottom, it's the space between lines of text. Okay? Now, why is it called leading? Oh, I think about kerning. And how do I remember kerning? How do I remember kerning is the space between each letter. And I think of the kernels on a cob of corn. I think about kernels, you know, corn on the cob, right? And that will help me think about letters. Now, leading, back when Mr. Gutenberg was inventing the printing press, how did they make sure that the letters weren't going to run into each other when they printed the letters? They had to add space. How did they do that? Little strips of lead. Actual lead. Actual little pieces of metal of lead. And so the leading, that has stayed through the centuries as space between lines of text. Okay, talked about italics. Oh, baseline is also critical. 2 more. Oops. Baseline is the line, the resting line for all letters. Okay? Whether it's a capital, uppercase, lowercase, capital, small letter, whether it's an A, O, M, P, X, P, Q, H, T. So if the letter comes down, doesn't matter. There's a baseline that all of the text will rest on. That's called the baseline. And the last one is X height. X height. Is anybody, let me see. Is the size of the font of the font of the letter in points. So I believe that we've all heard of 12-point font and 10-point font and 24-point font, right? So when you're typing and you get to choose what size letters you want, you go up to the size and it starts usually about 8 and it goes up to about 72 on your default menu. And then you get to choose somewhere between there, and the bigger the number, the bigger the letters, right? Well, how do you determine, so we call it the X height because small case x, the lowercase x, they measure that letter to determine the font size. Okay? Because H's and F's and G's and capital letters are all different. Okay? So, and they use a lowercase X to determine the size. And for the real trivia folks in here, 72 points equals 1 inch. Why? Because back in Gutenberg's day, that's what it was. There's really no other reason. And once things are established, they kind of keep with it. It's kind of like laws. They tend to not change unless they absolutely have to. Okay? 1 inch. 1 inch. Okay. Now, I do hope you have this written down, because as you design your letters for your logo, this is going to come in handy. You got to think font style, you're going to think font size, you're going to think how close are the letters, how far apart are the letters, how close are multiple lines of text, and how they relate to each other. Hierarchy, I'm not going to worry about that too much. There we are, letting, tracking, and kerning. Okay? And this is on the slideshow I provided for you. So letting is the space between the lines of text. Tracking is the amount of space of a particular line of text. And then kerning, we talked about the space between each letter, from one letter to the next. Okay? We didn't talk about alignment, but I'm not going to worry about that right now.
Typography. It's everywhere we look. In the books we read.
How much time do we have?
On the websites we visit. Even in everyday life. On street signs, bumper stickers, and product packaging. Simply put, typography is the style or appearance of text. It can also refer to the art of working with text, something you probably do all the time if you create documents or other projects for work, school, or yourself. Typography can be an intimidating subject, but it doesn't have to be. You only need to know a little to make a big difference in the stuff you do every day. So let's get started. First, some common types of fonts and what you need to know about them. Serif fonts have little strokes called serifs attached to the main part of the letter. Because of their classic look, they're a good choice for more traditional projects. They're also common in print publications, like magazines and newspapers. Sans serif fonts don't have that extra stroke, hence the name, which is French for without serif. This style is considered more clean and modern than serif fonts. Also, it tends to be easier to read on computer screens, including smartphones and tablets. Display fonts come in many different styles, like script, black letter, all caps, and just plain fancy. Because of their decorative nature, display fonts are best for small amounts of text. For example, titles and headers, and more graphic-heavy designs. In a way, fonts have their own language. They all have something to say beyond the words on the page. They can come across as casual or neutral, exotic or graphic. That's why it's important to think about your message and pick a font that fits. Some fonts come with extra baggage, like Comic Sans, Curls, Papyrus, and many more. There's nothing particularly wrong with these fonts. They just have a certain reputation for being outdated and overused. If you find yourself tempted by them, think twice and consider using something else. There are many fonts with a similar look and feel that are less likely to detract from your message. When deciding which fonts to use, less is more. It's best to limit yourself to 1 or 2 per project. If you need more contrast, try repeating one of your fonts in a different size, weight, or style. This trick is practically foolproof for creating interesting combinations that work. You've probably heard the saying, opposites attract. Well, the same is true for fonts. Don't be be afraid to combine font styles that are different but complementary, like sans serif with serif, short with tall, or decorative with simple. This can be challenging at first, but don't despair. Look to other designs for inspiration, and soon you'll get the hang of it. Maybe you've heard terms like kerning, leading, tracking, and hierarchy. For those with more experience, these concepts are essential for creating professional-looking designs. As a beginner, you don't need to know everything about these terms, just enough to inform your work and help you talk about design with more confidence. Hierarchy is used to guide the reader's eye to whatever is most important. In other words, it shows them where to begin and where to go next, using different levels of emphasis. Establishing hierarchy is simple. Just decide which elements you want the reader to notice first, then make them stand out. High-level items are usually larger, bolder, or different in some way. Remember to keep it simple and stick to just a few complementary styles. Leading is the space between lines of text, also known as line spacing. If you're not sure how much line spacing to use, don't fret. The default is usually fine. The goal is to make your text as comfortable to read as possible. Too much or too little spacing can make things unpleasant for the reader. Tracking is the overall space between characters, sometimes called character spacing. Most programs let you condense or expand this depending on your needs. Between specific characters. Unlike tracking, it varies over the course of the word because each letter fits together differently. Some fonts have what we call bad kerning, making certain letters look improperly spaced. If a font you're using has bad kerning, it's best to cut your losses and choose something else. Well-crafted text can mean the difference between an ordinary project and an extraordinary project, even if you're just getting started with design. All it takes is an interest in typography, and you'll start to notice more, see more, and be able to do more in your own work. We hope you enjoyed learning the basics of...
Okay, here we go. Cool. Okay, so at this point, let's go to Photopea. There we go. Okay. So Photopea, I want to spend probably, well, my hope is 10 minutes to walk you through some of the basics of working with text and type in Photopea. And so let's go ahead and get Photopea up. It's going to be a new project. And then when you have designed in your journal or whatever, wherever you've done it, when you've come up with your final design for your club logo, and you think, I want my text to look like this, these couple of things I'm going to show you in the Photopea could be helpful in creating your design. So it's important to think about what you want to create as opposed to what is something that is handed to you, which is why I kind of avoid, see all of these examples that you can kind of click on and get started with. They're fine, they're good, but they're not yours. So I'm going to call this project, this new project, I'm going to call it Type Test 1. And I'm going to go to print, I'm going to go to letter, I'm going to change millimeters to inches. My background is going to be white. So type text 1 and I click create. And there I am. I'm ready to rock and roll. There we go. And then I select the type tool, the capital T over on the left-hand side. Let me do my magnifying thing here. So type test 1 is the title of the document. I have my type tool down here ready to go. When I click on the, oops, I didn't want to do that. I got to get rid of that letter, that layer. So I should only have one layer. It should be background. It should be locked. Let me look at the. Okay. Now when I click and drag, and I always click and drag, excuse me, to make a text box. And the reason I click and drag to make a text box is because I want my text to be contained in a certain area. If I just click and start typing, it's going to keep going to the right until I hit my return key. If I click and drag and I make a text box, then the text will automatically go down when it hits the right edge of the text box. Okay. Now when I look up top, Deja Vu Sans will start there, that's fine. And I have 24 pixels. Okay, PX means pixels. What's the difference between a pixel and a point? Now we're getting specific. A point, as I mentioned, if you can remember that, is 1/72 of an inch. There's 72 points to an inch, because that's pretty small. A pixel depends upon your resolution. Okay. Now I have this document set at 300 dpi, which is dots per inch, or we could say pixels per inch. So for this, the point size is a heck of a lot smaller. 1/300, one pixel is 1/300th of an inch as compared to 1/72 of an inch. Okay, so it's teeny, teeny, tiny, tiny. So I can do a couple of things. I'm going to go ahead and get stuff started. So I'm going to type the word digital arts. You can almost see it there. And underneath it, I'm going to type West Salem High School. Now, you can see it, so I have to select it, and then I'm going to change my point size to 150. I have to capitalize high for high school. Okay. Now, my text is green. So, and I can change the text as long as it is selected. So I have to select it first. Now if I want it to go back to black, I can come down to the bottom here and choose black, and I click OK. What is selected becomes the opposite or complementary of the color that I've chosen. So I've chosen black text, but it looks white on black. If I choose green text, it looks like a magenta or a red on black, because that's the complementary color of the green. If I choose blue, it looks more like a yellow or an orange. If I choose red, it's going to look more like a green. That's like a teal, but anyway. So it's the complementary color. Okay. If I wanted to make my text even bigger, I double click up here in the size, and I can choose, I don't know, let's say 220. And then I hit my enter key. And now I've got something even larger. Oh, what? Oh, it's outside the text box. So I just make my text box bigger. Okay. And so for the size that I want, it's a little too big, so I might want to back this back down to 200. No, still not quite enough. Let's try 180. Okay, and I can extend my text box a little bit. So now I've got my Digital Arts West Salem High School. Okay. There. We didn't talk about alignment too much, but right now you see alignment at the top of the page. We have, now again, when I was your age and I was learning this stuff, we would call it flush left, centered, and flush right. Why did we use the term flush? Because flush means things are aligned and clean and straight. But now we use the word align because we do. So we have a line left, centered, and a line right, okay? Now, the other thing that's usually up here that I don't see anymore is called justified, and that's where you have all of the text, even on the outsides of the text box, and that's kind of, so now I have it centered because that's what I want. If I want to change my font style, this is going to be a title, so I'm going to look for something a little more bold. I have to think, do I want a serif font because I have the little lines at the end of all the letters, or do I want something that's a sans serif font but still a little bit bold? Let's see here. Boldly 1, okay, and then it changes. Now you can see that this boldly 1, I've got to bring this down even more so that my my title can fit on 2 lines. Okay. Now, this is where it gets fun. Okay. Over here on the right-hand side of the document, you'll see a capital T and a little t, uppercase and lowercase. You'll see a backwards P for paragraph and then a letter A for glyphs. I'm going to click on the character one. Okay. You see the size in pixels. You see, oh, tracking. Anybody remember what tracking is? You just kind of play around with it. So I'm clicking on the word tracking, and if I increase it, it's going to separate the letters bit by bit. If I come to the left, it's going to have the letters kind of run into each other. Now at some point it's pretty cool, and then at some point it's just visually confusing. So remember, the priority is legibility. Leading is the space between the lines of type. So I can make it very, very tight. I can even have them on top of each other if I want, which is kind of silly. Or I can have them very close together. So I could have all my, my mouse is not being very cooperative here. So I can have my letters get all scrunched if I want to. Or I can have them breathe a little bit. All right. Oh, baseline shift. Yeah, we're not going to worry about that. And then down here, you sort of have default font styles, type styles. Like you have the, what is it called? Supertext, superscript, and subscript. So if you're adding an exponent to a letter or a number, and you have this other one down here for like a footnote kind of thing, underline, strike through, italicized, and so those you can just, once your text is selected and you hit one of those, it will change to that particular style, which are fairly common. The font color is also here. If I want to change the color again, I can. I am going to change it, by the way. I want to change it back to a darker green. And I click OK. Now it's like a pink kind of a thing. Okay. Now when I'm done, I just click off of it. Okay. I hit my little capital lowercase t, and now I have this. Now another secret, okay, is I'm going to come out of this real quick here. I always, you know, once I get my font layer there, now I'm going to make a copy of that layer because I want to preserve the first idea that I had, which is a very simple 2 lines, sans serif block-like text, and I have my kerning and my leading all set the way I like it. Thank you very much. Okay. But let's say I want to mess around with it a little bit. Okay. So I'm going to duplicate this layer so that I can preserve my first idea. Duplicate layer. I go to my move tool. Oops. Go to my move tool, and there I am. I've got two. Now I'm going to take my first one, I'm going to make it invisible. I can still see it here, but I can't see it on the page. So now I've got this one. I click on my capital T, and now up here at the top, let me go ahead and zoom in again. I have this thing called warp. So if I want to make this into an arc, either up or down, I can do that. Let me put those off to the side a little bit. If I want it to look like it's kind of coming out towards the viewer or away from the viewer, I can do that. If I want to exaggerate the vertical dimensions, I can do that. Okay? Let's bend it. Okay? And then once I'm happy with that, I click OK. Now I also have a bunch of other kinds of arcs that I can or different ways to distort the letters. I can do that there, but I like that. That's good. Whoops. I thought I clicked OK, but apparently I didn't. Let's try that again. Warp, arc, I click OK. There we go. So now I've got two ideas. Now if I want to, because it's a little big, it's off the page, I click on my move tool and I can resize it. Now I'm going to go back to my original idea, and I'm going to duplicate that layer again, and I'm going to move it again. And so now I want to play around with this line. I can make the other ones invisible just so that they're not in my way, right? And then I can come under, let's see, edit and transform. Now if I try to do some other things like, let's say, skew, I could try and do that. Well, no I can't, so I'm going to undo that. The better thing to do is to rasterize the layer so that it's no longer a text box. It's like a shape, okay? So now when I come under Edit and Transform, I have more options. I have my warp option down here. I've got perspective and distort and skew, all kinds of cool things, right? And I can kind of have fun with it that way. And so rasterizing a layer, and you can see, let me zoom in here, where my layer over here is now looks a little transparent in the background. The capital T's tell me these are text boxes, and this is, even though it looks like a text box, it is not a text box, okay? Now if I go to, let's see here, gotta remember how to do this. So I'm here. If I go under filter, I've got some ideas here as well. 3D, that's not how I get to 3D. Let me think about this. I go to layer. I don't have layer style. There's layer style. So under layer style, and I'll write this on the whiteboard, under layer style you come down to 3D. Wow. So now if I want to, I can, I always change the color here. I want to go sort of a gray. My distance, my angle. There we go. So I'll write that up on the board. If you want to do a little 3D thing, you can do that as well. I'm going to keep that up there. Okay, so $46. Okay, so I don't want green. Where's my red? Let's do black. Okay. So type tool. Capital T, type tool. Click and drag to make a text box. And then you also always want to duplicate the layer. When you're doing something, a new design. Okay. And then if you go to rasterize the layer, sounds like I'm cooking when I say that. So you right click and then choose rasterize. And then you can go to layer, layer style, and then you can go to 3D or a bunch of other stuff, but 3D is kind of the cool one. Okay, here we go. So we're here for about another 20 minutes. That was a lot of stuff, but I wanted to make sure that you got it. So as you're thinking about text and typography, you can kind of refer back to the notes and get some ideas of how to push forward.